Today, we're diving into one of the most incredible true stories of survival and sheer ingenuity you will ever hear. I mean, this is the kind of story that sounds like it was ripped straight from a Hollywood script, but I promise you, it is 100% real. It's about a cargo plane, a captured crew, and a year-long nightmare that ends in a death-defying escape from the heart of Afghanistan. Let's get right into it. And these are the words of the man right at the center of it all, Commander Vladimir Sharpatov. We're starting at the end here for a reason, because the outcome is so unbelievable, you almost have to hear it first to believe the rest of the story. He brought them all home. But how on earth he pulled it off? Well, that's where our story really begins. So let's rewind to August 3rd, 1995. Sharpatov and his crew are on what they were all hoping would be their last flight of a contract mission. Now, in aviation, there's this old superstition: you never, ever call a flight your last. As they were about to find out, some superstitions hold a very heavy, very real truth. What's so fascinating here is just how little the crew understood about the situation on the ground. You have to remember, after the Soviets pulled out, real news from Afghanistan was pretty sparse. Sharpatov had heard the term Taliban, sure, but the root word Talib, as you can see, just means student. He figured, okay, maybe they're protesters, they'll calm down eventually. He had no idea he was flying into the capital of heavily armed and incredibly powerful military movement. So you might be asking, why even take the risk? Why fly that last flight? Well, the reasons were just deeply, deeply human. It all came down to real life. One of the crew had a massive car loan to pay off. The co-pilot, a former Air Force guy, hadn't flown in 2 years and was just desperate for work. The radio operator laid off from his factory job. The navigator needed cash for repairs on his home. These weren't soldiers or spies. They were just regular guys trying to make a living in some really tough times. So they're flying over Kandahar, business as usual, and then everything changes. A voice cracks over the radio, a voice Sharpatov actually recognized from previous trips, and tells him there's a MiG-21 fighter jet just 200 meters off his tail. Sharpatov, thinking fast, tries to stall. He says they're too heavy, too much fuel to land, hoping he can just circle until the MiG has to refuel. But then he looks down and sees another fighter jet being rolled out of a hangar. The voice comes back, cold and firm. Perform approach. This is an order. They were completely out of options. The second their wheels hit the tarmac, Sharpatov knows they are in serious, serious trouble. As they're being taken from the plane, he remembers his flight logbook. It's got everything: the names of his crew, their entire flight path, all the mission details. Thinking incredibly fast, he rips out the pages, stuffs them in his mouth, chews them into a pulp, and swallows the evidence. Can you even imagine? His first act, his first thought, was to protect his men. Their capture marked the beginning of an absolutely brutal ordeal. What came next was over a year in captivity, a period that would test their will to live in every single way you can imagine. 378 days. Just let that number sink in for a second. Over a year. Held in a sweltering, filthy prison, sleeping on a concrete floor with your fist for a pillow, and having absolutely no idea if you would ever see your home or your family again. The physical hardship was one thing, but the psychological terror, that was relentless. Sharpatov described how every single night, the sound of footsteps in the corridor would send a jolt of pure fear through them. Was this the night? Were they coming for him? He could literally hear the guards walking on the roof right above his head as he tried to sleep. That constant, gnawing uncertainty was a special kind of torture. Hope would arrive in these little waves, and each time it was just brutally crushed. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs sent a delegation. They left empty-handed. The government of Tatarstan, where some of the crew were from, sent a top aide who spoke 3 languages. Still nothing. On a third visit, the Taliban leaders actually swore on the Quran that they would release them. And then they just broke their promise. It became painfully clear they weren't prisoners, they were hostages, and diplomacy was going absolutely nowhere. With any hope of a diplomatic solution completely gone, a new, unbelievably audacious idea started to form. See, the Taliban were very, very interested in their Il-76 cargo plane. It was modern, it was powerful. They wanted Sharpatov to fly for them, to train their own pilots. He flat out refused, but their obsession with the aircraft gave him an idea. If the plane was their prison, maybe, just maybe, it could also be their key to freedom. And this is where Sharpatov starts playing chess. He began this brilliant, elaborate ruse.
He told the guards that in the insane 50 degrees Celsius heat, the engine oil would coke up, the parts would seize, and their precious plane would become a useless hunk of metal. And they bought it. The Taliban started taking the crew to the plane for technical work, always in shifts, leaving some guys behind as collateral. But Sharpatov wasn't just checking engines, he was conducting reconnaissance. He was memorizing every inch of that airfield, noting every single weakness he could find.
And here you can just see the cold, hard calculation of an experienced pilot's mind at work. He noticed that the MiG-21 they kept on alert had external fuel tanks strapped to it. Now to you and me that means nothing, but to Sharpatov, it meant everything. He knew that with those tanks, the MiG couldn't break the sound barrier. It was slower. He did the math in his head. From the moment they started their takeoff roll, it would take the Taliban pilot at least 25 minutes to get in the air and intercept them. It was a window, a tiny but crucial window. But they still needed one more thing, a reason for the entire crew to be on the plane at the exact same time. And then, fate, luck, whatever you want to call it, intervened. During one of their taxiing tests, a tire burst. They had a spare, they had the tools on board, and it gave them the perfect excuse to demand that the whole crew be brought to the airfield to do the heavy repair work. The trap was finally set. And that brings us to August 16th, 1996. After 378 days of hell, the moment was here. They absolutely knew this was their one and only shot. It was now, or it was never. So, while the crew is working on the plane, the call to afternoon prayer echoes across the airfield. Just as they had hoped, most of the guards put down their weapons and left their posts to pray. Only 3 guards remained on the plane with the crew. This was it. This was the razor-thin window they had been waiting for over a year. In that instant, the decision was absolute. There was no hesitation, no turning back. As Sharpatov said later, they were all in. The alternative was to stay and probably die in Kandahar anyway. The risk of dying in the air was a hell of a lot better than the certainty of dying on the ground. They start the engines. As the giant plane lumbers onto the runway, they see it. Trucks, cars, a whole crowd of vehicles racing to cut them off. And the physics were screaming at them. Look at these numbers. The plane was 21 tons overweight. The tires, after sitting for a year, were underinflated. They needed a takeoff speed of at least 280 kilometers per hour, but the sluggish, heavy beast was only getting up to 220. The end of the runway is rushing towards them, fast, and right beyond it, barbed wire and a minefield left over from the war. With absolutely no other choice, Sharpatov hauls back on the yoke. The massive Il-76 groans, it protests, and then it lifts off the very last slab of concrete, clearing the deadly minefield by mere meters. They were airborne. But they weren't safe. Not yet. The 3 armed guards still on board finally realized what was happening. As one of them chambered around in his weapon, Sharpatov executed a maneuver that is just straight out of an action movie. He pulled the plane into a steep climb, then shoved the nose down abruptly. For a split second, everyone inside was weightless. The guards were literally floating in the air. Then, he pulled up again, slamming them hard onto the floor. In that moment of disorientation, the crew jumped on them and tied them up. So, how do you make a giant cargo plane disappear from radar? You fly so low, you basically become part of the landscape. Sharpatov flew just 50 to 70 meters off the desert floor. To put that in perspective, the plane's wingspan is 50 meters. He was literally skimming the tops of sand dunes. They flew towards Iran and used these secret code words a diplomat had slipped them to get clearance across the border, tricking Iranian air traffic control into thinking they were a totally different flight. So, they finally land in Sharjah in the UAE, and the ordeal has one last completely bizarre twist. Sharpatov, who now has this massive beard after a year in captivity, opens the cockpit window. The police on the ground take one look at him and think he's a Taliban hijacker and are ready to open fire. Then, when they storm the plane and start beating the captured guards, it's the Russian crew who steps in to protect their former captors, saying, hey, they were just soldiers following orders. And after all that, after the capture, the year of imprisonment, the brilliant escape plan, the life-or-death flight, what was Commander Shapatov's first thought when he finally landed safely? It wasn't about heroism. It wasn't about fame. He was just incredibly thirsty. It's just such a simple, perfectly human end to an absolutely epic journey. The story of the escape from Kandahar is just a masterclass in resilience, in courage, and in brilliant quick thinking. And it really leaves you with this question to ponder. When everything seems completely lost, when the odds are stacked so impossibly against you,
What is it deep inside the human spirit that just refuses to give up and finds a way to fly?